At the end of this next session, of course, there's going to be a break, and Sean will probably come back and end this session. I'm not sure where Sean is. I just want to thank Sean and Jonathan and for all their hard work. We're so appreciative to have you all here. And when we're done this afternoon, there'll be a break. And then don't forget, at the South Ballroom is where the banquet will be held. And the banquet is at 6 o'clock. And Nathan Winters will be speaking at that, and we'll have a few other things in conjunction. And then before you leave this afternoon, make sure you go by the table out there in the entryway, and there's the schedule for tomorrow. And you'll look through it, you'll see exactly what's happening. There'll be a couple of breakouts on that tomorrow morning. Bill Twitchell will be speaking to us, an attorney from Pinedale. We'll be doing some discussions on crisis pregnancy centers and other things along that, as well as a presentation by Sue Wilson on how to work with your legislator. And so these will be very beneficial tomorrow as well. So we want to make sure that you make every effort to be here tomorrow. If you did not get a ticket for the banquet, make sure you talk to my son at the table in the foyer before you leave when this is over, and we'll see if we can make sure we get you included in that. We want to have you. And so it's so good to have Ryan with us. He's going to come back and finish this afternoon. As he was speaking to us in the last session, I was thinking about a verse in 2 Timothy. We've been studying in my church through 2 Timothy, and Paul said there, I suffer trouble as a criminal, even to the point of chains, but the word of God is not chained. And that is a powerful statement. You know, the world can try to chain the messenger, but it cannot chain the message. And God's word will go forth, and the truth is powerful because it is the truth. And so as we hear some more concerning the truth today, we're so pleased to have Ryan in Wyoming, and we hope we can get Ryan back to Wyoming another time.
Yes. Okay, great. So this last session is mainly everything that I was saving that I haven't. Oh, that's a recorder. I was wondering that. I've been sitting there wondering what that was. Perfect. I mean, I just assume the NSA is always. Never say anything that I wouldn't want to show up on YouTube. So I want to, in this last session, do a couple things. One, I want to talk about 3 specific public policies, pieces of legislation, and that might lead into 4. But I also want to put it into a larger framework. And what I do throughout the Truth Overruled book, and someone had asked during the break if I had brought copies with me, and unfortunately, no, I try to travel without checking luggage. So for the trip last night at CSU and then today, it's just cumbersome to be carrying a box of books and get it through. But you can get it for $10 on Amazon. This was a book that we wanted to be priced so that it wasn't, you know, some of those academic books are like $150, and you know, they're priced so that only academic libraries buy it. That's not what this was about. We wanted to get this out very quickly. So the ebook version came out 2 weeks after the court's decision. The ebook's $9, the Kindle version is $9, the paperback is $10 on Amazon. And it's written so that anyone can understand it. If you've gone to high school, you can read this book. It's not written for other PhDs, the way that some academic books are. And it covers, you're welcome. And so it covers, the first 3 chapters are on the marriage question, the second 3 chapters are on the religious liberty question, and the last 3 questions are on the what do we do now question. So it's a 9-chapter book, about 200 pages. And I get a nickel for every copy that Amazon sells. So, but the major pieces, oh yeah, so the title is Truth Overruled, the Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. Truth Overruled, the Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. The reason the ebook had come out 2 weeks after the Supreme Court decision is I started writing this book this time last year. I was at CU Boulder, and then I went to Colorado Springs, and I spoke at an event there with Bishop Sheridan. I was writing the book on the plane for that trip. I was writing it in the hotel room, because most of us could predict what Anthony Kennedy was about to do. That doesn't mean that what he did is the right thing. It doesn't mean that what he did was excusable. It just means it was predictable. And my question was, well, what should we do in response? What do we do now? And to do that, I tried to learn some of the history of the pro-life movement. What did the pro-life movement do after Roe v. Wade that we can now say in hindsight was successful? And so I want to share 3 overarching lessons that I take from the pro-life movement that kind of is peppered throughout the book. And then the last one's going to be a multi-part lesson, so I'm cheating by putting multiple prongs there. The first is that they rejected Roe. The pro-life movement never accepted Roe v. Wade as good constitutional law. They never accepted Roe v. Wade as the truth about the Constitution or the truth about unborn human life. And they insisted that the Supreme Court does not get the last word about the sanctity of unborn human life. And so I don't know how many people from Wyoming traveled to Washington, D.C. on January 22nd, but for 42 years and counting, hundreds of thousands of people come to D.C. on January 22nd in the bitter cold, frequently in the snow, for the March for Life, precisely because that's the date on which Roe v. Wade was decided. And they're there to bear witness that the Supreme Court didn't get it right, and that the Supreme Court's word isn't the final word. That march that Nellie Gray started, that very first anniversary after the Roe v. Wade decision, that witness has been vital in keeping the issue alive in American public life. That all the talking heads said the abortion issue is over, pro-lifers have lost, the next generation, all young people, are pro-life or are pro-choice, pro-lifers are on the wrong side of history, all the elites were evolving. Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Ted Kennedy, Jesse Jackson, they all started their political careers being pro-life. They then evolved in office and became pro-choice. The media elite was saying that the last pro-lifers will be in nursing homes and will be inside the walls of the Vatican. That's not what happened. My generation is more pro-life than my parents' generation. A majority of Americans now identify as pro-life. And it's because of the work that they did bearing witness to the truth. And part of that was saying that the Supreme Court had told a lie. The Supreme Court didn't get it right, and that this ruling isn't settled. If anything, the abortion issue is the most unsettled issue in American public life today. The second thing the pro-life movement did, I'm going to mention the legislation here, is that they protected their freedom. I already mentioned the Church Amendment, that after Roe v. Wade, a bipartisan coalition was successful at saying, even if you're personally pro-choice, there's no reason for the government to be persecuting people who are pro-life. And so through the Church Amendment and the Weldon Amendment and a variety of conscience protection legislation, we've been able to protect pro-life doctors and nurses and hospitals and pharmacists. And it's what allows, up until the HHS mandate, that consensus to go forward. It was only with the HHS contraception mandate that someone had violated that 35-year consensus that you allow Catholics and evangelicals and other pro-lifers to be medical professionals. We have to do the same thing now. And the way of thinking about this is to think of there's good policy that could be enacted and there's bad policy that must be resisted. So let me start with the bad policy. This is the Houston bill that was defeated last week. I'm told via email that Dallas just passed a version of this today, that their city council voted it in. And that's frequently how this happens, is that when it's a popular vote, the people don't go for something. When you can get a vote of the elites, whether it's a city council or unelected judges, then you can get the progressive social agenda advanced. So same-sex marriage was not one at the ballot box. It was 31 of 31 states that voted on this, voted against it, and then judges started striking down those laws. And then we lost 3 votes in the 2012 election, and then the rest of the states fell by judges again. And so the momentum here was an elite thing, either elite judges, or in the case of Houston, the city council passed that bathroom bill. The pastor said, no, this is a bad idea. They collected the signatures. The mayor then subpoenaed their sermons to see if they were violating laws by doing this. The mayor threw out the vast majority of the signatures. They appealed it, went up to the Texas Supreme Court, And unanimously, the court said, no, this needs to be up for a vote. You got the number of signatures required for a vote. So the people have a great amount of power and authority. That's one of the things that I want to encourage you in the state of Wyoming to consider, is that maybe your legal elite or your elected officials are out of step with the value of the citizens of Wyoming, and consider what you can do to take it straight to the people. So the bad bill, sexual orientation and gender identity. The acronym is SOGI. These are the laws that have been enacted at the state and the local level. And just today, Obama announced his support for the federal version of this. And it adds that phrase, sexual orientation and gender identity, to existing non-discrimination ordinances. So as I mentioned, in the 1960s, there was a need for the federal government to pass the Civil Rights Act. Think about what it was like being African American in the South in the 60s, and you can understand why having protections on the basis of race in anti-discrimination law made sense. They're now using that legacy to say sexual orientation and gender identity should be added to all the existing anti-discrimination laws. So at the federal level, it's called the Equality Act. Houston, it was called the HERO Ordinance, the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. It used to be called ENDA at the federal level, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. But what originally was only going to cover employment now covers employment and housing and credit and public accommodations. And it's an expanded definition of public accommodations. The Civil Rights Act of '64 defined public accommodations rather narrowly as things like hotels and hospitals and restaurants and buses and trains. Now they're defining every private business that is open to the public as a public accommodation. That's how Houston law did it, and that's how the Equality Act does it. The problem with these laws are a multi-pronged problem. The basic level is that it inscribes into law that the belief that we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other, is the functional equivalent of racism. So at the conceptual level, what is the problem with these laws? Is it says that if you believe that we're created male and female, and that our biological identity is something to be cherished and fostered, not kind of mutilated or changed, and if you believe that man and woman is created for each other inside of marriage, that viewpoint is a discriminatory viewpoint. That just is, by definition, either sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination, akin to racism. So it sets up the conceptual level by elevating orientation and gender identity to a protected class. That these traditional beliefs are precisely the beliefs that you're trying to protect them from. So where this is played out, these are the laws that have been used to penalize the baker, the florist, the photographer, to shut down Catholic charity adoption agencies. These will be the laws that I believe will be used to justify removing nonprofit tax status of schools or accreditation of schools. These are the laws that have been used for the bathroom policies, biological males who identify as women, using men's rooms, locker rooms, playing on the boys' sports team, the girls' sports teams, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not sufficient to just try to exempt yourself from the law, because you could never create an exemption that would be large enough. The only way to exempt yourself from the law in a sufficient way would just be to defeat the law in the first place. And if you want your public policy to serve the common good, you want your public policy to reflect the truth. And the truth of the matter is that understanding our humanity as male and female created for each other isn't a form of discrimination. And so we don't want to establish it in law that it is, and then exempt certain individuals or certain institutions from that ordinance. So one thing is to be careful if your state house or any of your city councils are thinking about enacting a SOGI ordinance, a sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's the bad policy to be resisted. Good policy to be enacted. You can have a RFRA, a FADA, or various standalone kind of partial instantiations of FADA. So I'll go to those last. But the RFRA is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. That's the bill that I mentioned that was passed at the federal level in '93. unanimously in the House, 93 votes in the Senate. Ted Kennedy sponsored it in the Senate. Chuck Schumer sponsored it in the House. Bill Clinton signed it into law. And it simply establishes a balancing test. It says government can only substantially burden the exercise of religion for a compelling government interest in the least restrictive way possible. So if you have your religious freedom burdened, it gives you a day in court to show that it's been substantially burdened, and then it has the government have its day in court to show that it was for a compelling state interest in the least restrictive way possible. So it's a broad bill that would cover all forms of religion, all forms of religious beliefs, and it simply establishes a test to adjudicate those claims. It doesn't say who wins. Sometimes the religious claimant will win, sometimes the government will win. It simply establishes a way in which to decide who should win. And it's a common sense bill. I mean, this is the type of thing that you would want to have as public policy. Why should the government be substantially burdening the exercise of religion if it's not for a compelling state interest in the least restrictive way possible? Right? We don't want the government infringing on liberty. It's just for these frivolous purposes. So that's the RFRA. The FADA, the First Amendment Defense Act, that's the one that I mentioned earlier, establishes the bright line rule that government can never penalize someone, either an individual or an institution, because they believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman. So it doesn't establish the balancing test, because it's not for a broad, wide range of views. It singles out one particular view, and it says the state never has justification for penalizing people who act on this viewpoint. And the way to understand this is that this is the viewpoint that was your state law up until just several months ago. And so for people who continue to believe this and people who continue to act on this viewpoint, there's no state justification in penalizing them. So it establishes that limiting point, that bright line, like the Church Amendment. There's no reason to force a pro-life doctor or nurse to perform or pay for an abortion. Then I mentioned that there are the kind of standalone provisions. What we saw in Texas, in North Carolina, and in Michigan were kind of partial First Amendment Defense Acts. In Texas, they had one that protected priests and pastors. Partly this was because they saw what happened with the subpoena for the sermons. I think the Texas law is the least necessary because if the First Amendment protects anything, it at least protects the freedom of worship, and it at least protects priests and pastors. So I think Texas, it was a symbolic piece of legislation. I highly doubt it's a necessary piece of legislation. Pastors and priests will be protected under the First Amendment when it comes to their religious freedom. The question is, will anyone else be protected? And the left is at least willing to say a priest or a pastor have religious freedom inside a house of worship. The question is, will lay members of the congregation have religious freedom? And will they have religious freedom outside of the four walls of the chapel? So Michigan, in the month before the Supreme Court's marriage decision, passed the bill that protected adoption agencies. They saw what happened in Massachusetts, they saw what happened in Illinois, they saw what happened in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., and they said, we don't want that to happen here. And so Michigan passed a bill that singled out adoption agencies and said, we won't be rescinding funding, grants, contracts, or licensing because they seek homes for children with married moms and dads. North Carolina, in about 2 to 3 weeks before the Supreme Court's ruling, passed a bill that protected county clerks and magistrates. Yes. They foresaw the Kim Davis situation, and they said there's no reason to have that situation. The bill that they passed said that every legally eligible couple in the state of North Carolina will receive a marriage license in an orderly and timely fashion, but we're going to accommodate as many clerks and magistrates as possible. What they're instructed to do is to notify their superior ahead of time. Notify their superior now if they have any objections. Their supervisor will reassign them to some other task within their office and will assign someone to marriage duty who has no objections. This way, every couple receives a license without ever having any inconvenience, and clerks don't have to violate their beliefs. Of course, this only works insofar as in every office there's a clerk or a magistrate who's willing to do the same-sex marriage license. So the accommodations has a limit. You can only accommodate people provided that within the office someone doesn't have an objection. So far, this hasn't posed a problem because the same-sex marriage question is about a 50-50 issue in American life. And so far, they've been able to accommodate all of the clerks who said they had an objection because there were other people in the office who didn't have an objection. This is exactly what Kim Davis was asking for, this sort of an accommodation. What's interesting about last week's election is that for the first time in 40-some years, a Republican was elected governor. He ran explicitly defending Kim Davis. The Attorney General is the one who lost that election. He ran opposing Kim Davis.
All right.
And he has announced, the governor-elect, that he will just be taking clerks' names off of the marriage licenses in the first place. But there's no need to have the clerk's name on the license. A simple way of accommodating the consciences of the clerk. Kim Davis had pointed out the original Kentucky marriage license said bride and groom. After the Supreme Court redefined marriage, the governor's office issued an updated marriage license that said party 1 and party 2. And she had asked, well, when you're issuing the updated license, can you also, if you're accommodating the same-sex couples, can you also accommodate the clerks who believe the truth about marriage? And the governor refused to do so. That governor didn't run for re-election, but his attorney general did, and the Democrat lost. And I think for 40 of the past 44 years, a Democrat has been the governor of Kentucky, but no longer. Which is simply to say that these bills aren't, in Houston, they predicted that the HERO ordinance would pass overwhelmingly, and it was defeated 62 to 38. Which is something to say that the elite culture, the media culture, vastly overstates the support for progressive social policy. And so insofar as you have the ability to force these issues at a popular vote level, rather than allowing it to be done behind closed doors by the city council or by the state house, I think you're going to have a chance for better outcomes. Then again, I don't follow Wyoming politics particularly closely, so I defer to kind of your judgment. I would say these are the sorts of policies that you do want to get enacted. Figure out what's the best way of doing it given your situation. The experience of other jurisdictions does suggest that the people tend to be more sensible than the elites. I spoke in Fayetteville, Arkansas, this time last year, it was October of last year, and then they had a vote to rescind the sexual orientation and gender identity law that their city council had passed. Fayetteville is the college town, it's where the University of Arkansas is. The city council rammed this through. When the citizens found out, they were like, no, we don't want this. They did the signature collection, they put it on the ballot box, and then they voted to repeal it. So again, it's just something to consider. The dynamics are different in each jurisdiction, but think about how those play out. So that's the second lesson from the pro-life movement, was protecting your freedom. And it was vitally important that the pro-lifers did protect their freedom because that allowed them to offer pro-life health care. It allowed pro-life doctors and pro-life nurses to be in the public square as credible voices. On the marriage issue, we want to protect the freedom of our institutions to educate and to shape the next generation. It's vital that universities and schools, marriage counseling centers, adoption agencies stay open. We also want to protect the freedom of our individuals, that they can be working in the commercial sphere without sacrificing their livelihoods. It's important that we protect religious freedom for everyone. Which leads to the third thing that the pro-life movement did successful, and that was they bore witness to the truth. And this is going to be the heavy lift on the marriage issue. This is going to be the challenging topic. And this is why we started this morning with the philosophical Aristotelian secular case for marriage. Because each and every one of us in our sleep can bear witness to the truth of unborn human life without appealing to scripture or theology. We now have the ability to make a secular, philosophic, scientific case about unborn children. Do we currently have the same ability and facility to do that on the marriage issue? And if not, all that means is that we have to put in the time to equip ourselves to be able to do that. And to do the same thing with our congregations, to do the same thing with our youth groups, to do the same thing with our high school campuses and our college campuses. That if you want to make a difference in the long run, you're going to want to be able to equip people to engage in this discussion using a vocabulary and a rhetoric and an idiom that their interlocutor can understand. And so if they make arguments starting from premises that their opponents reject, it probably won't go very far. But if they're arguing on the same basic terrain as their opponents, they can engage on the playing field of their adversary and defeat their adversary on their adversary's own terms and conditions and turf. That's what we have to prepare people to do. So part of that will be doing the philosophical case from this morning. Part of that will be learning the social science that I mentioned in answer to, I guess, your question this afternoon from the previous session. Part of that will be exposing people to the stories of people like Katie Faust and Heather Barwick and Bobby Lopez. There'll be a variety of things in making that public case. But I also want to say a couple of things about what the church can do in particular. And so let me just kind of list a couple of thoughts. One is, I mentioned that I started this morning with the Moynihan report and saying that the problem here isn't same-sex marriage. The problem here is marriage. And that for 50 years, straight people have been making a mess of marriage. The church needs to develop an effective response to the sexual revolution writ large. Our own young people are having their moral imaginations shaped more by Hollywood than they are by Scripture. Our own young people, the way they think about their own sexuality, their own marriages, their own families, are more shaped by pop culture than by the 2,000-year traditions and teachings and embodiment of the church. What can we do to respond to that? There have been a variety of attempts in different places, some more successful than others. The theology of the body within the Catholic Church is one of the better approaches on this. But there needs to be lots and lots of approaches just to figure out what works best, what speaks most effectively to various audiences. And it really needs to be something that's deliberate and systematic and not just a, one Sunday a year in Sunday school we talk about certain commandments. That's not going to be sufficient to counteract what young people are receiving Monday through Saturday at school, on the internet, on TV, on their smartphones. Just go down the list of all the countervailing forces, and that's what you're up against. And it's not the same-sex part primarily. It's the whole kit and caboodle. It's the hookup culture, it's cohabitation, it's pornography, it's masturbation. It's going to be all of the above. And there needs to be an effective pastoral approach to those issues. That's not just a series of thou shalt nots, a series of kind of hoops to jump through, but that can tell a story and paint a picture that's really attractive. Something that young people say, this is what I want to set my life on. This is what I desire most deeply, and this is what I want to prepare myself for. I want to cultivate certain virtues so that I can have a certain type of family. And that it matters what I start doing now, as a teenager, as a high school student, as a college student, so that I can lead a successful family when I do one day get married and have children. And again, I'm not a pastor, so I don't know how to do that. That's not my set of gifts. That's not my calling in life. I can identify that's the need, because I see we have lots of college students who intern at Heritage. I speak on college campuses every week, and I see that there's a hunger for that they have a desire for this, and that they aren't being sufficiently fed. A second thing for the church is to develop particular ministries for people with same-sex attractions. If we're not in favor of same-sex marriage, what are we in favor of for people with same-sex attractions? Again, you can't just say what you're against, you have to be able to say what you're for. And this is really the first time in the 2,000-year history of the church that same-sex attracted Christians are out in the open, in public, having this discussion publicly for the first time. And so there's an opportunity here. I mean, there's an opportunity. Some churches are going to have this conversation and respond to it better than others. And the fear is that on the one hand, you can just ignore it. On the other hand, you can become a heretical community. How are you both orthodox and loving and pastorally sensitive all at the same time? Right? So you don't want to ignore the issue. On the other hand, you don't want to start changing Christ's teachings. So what do you do in that situation? Here I mentioned earlier Eve Tushnet's book as a first kind of approach on this. There's a blog called Spiritual Friendship. Wesley Hill is a theology professor at Trinity. Evangelical has written a little bit about this. He's a same-sex attracted man. The documentary that The Apostle Encouraged is done, The Desire of Everlasting Hills. These are all just things that kind of help you get started and start thinking about this. Personally, I mean, I have some personal critiques of the way that the Spiritual Friendship blog approaches this because I think they're allowing their phenomenology drive their ontology. And for probably most of you that means nothing. But it's for someone with a PhD in political philosophy, those are the sort of jargony concepts we use. What I mean by that is that they're allowing their experiences to drive too much of their framework of how to interpret those experiences. And you need the proper philosophical and theological framework for that engaging in the narrative. Right? How do you tell the story? How do you interpret your own story will be determined by what sort of framework you're operating from. And so, I mean, that's my only critique of what they have done so far. But I want to encourage what they're doing because I think it's vitally important that we hear from those voices and that it be a dialogue where we can better understand what to do. But the conceptual question and the kind of specific ministries, if you have a Tuesday night meeting of courage at your church, that's necessary and good. It's not sufficient because there's also a question of, well, what should each and every one of us be doing with our same-sex attracted friends, members of our church community? Because there's a universal human longing and desire for community. Right? Every one of us in 2 weeks on Thursday needs a dinner table where we can sit down to have Thanksgiving. And if we're not in favor of marriage for the same-sex attracted Christians in our communities, where are they having that Thanksgiving dinner? Are we inviting them into our homes? Are we inviting them to be big brother and big sister, aunt and uncle, godmother and godfather to our children if they'll never have children of their own? What can we do to kind of graft them into our communities precisely to reject Justice Kennedy's outrageous claim that if we don't have gay marriage, gays and lesbians are going to be lonely? Right? So if we say Kennedy's wrong about that, what can we do within our congregations to foster an appropriate response? If it's not redefining marriage, what is it? And I think that's going to be a challenge. And it's something concrete that we can do to make a difference. The third suggestion here is that if you're the baker, the florist, and the photographer, what should you do? That's a question of pastoral care as well. And it's something that priests and pastors and ministry leaders in general can start helping to prepare their congregations.